Hey guys, tonight we're going to a funeral. Not yours, hopefully, but not your average weepy, rain-splattered, floral-overloaded affair either. You're stepping into a scene so richly layered in lace, lies, and lust. It makes modern dating. Apps look like Amish pen pal clubs. Picture this. The year is 1873. You're dressed in full mourning attire, jet beads, a high-necked black gown tailored tight enough to make breathing a privilege, and a veil so sheer it flirts for you. The air is thick with the scent of damp chrysanthemums and powdered lavender. You stand in a velvet-lined parlor where the deceased lies in an open casket that's less about grief and more about staging. Somewhere between the clink of teacups and the soft creak of a corset, a gentleman not too young, not too old, but just enough sadness in his eyes to make you curious, catches your gaze. The two of you exchange a nod. That's it. That's all it takes. Because here, mourning is theater. And the widows? They're the stars. You probably won't survive this. Socially if you smile too fast. But then again, Victorian society was a paradox machine. You were expected to grieve like a statue, weep just enough to be admired, and somehow maintain that delicate sex appeal that says, I'm available, but I'm holy about it. The game was both sacred and scandalous. Widowhood gave you something rare in a woman's 19th century life, power. But wield it too freely, and you'd be branded a black-clad Jezebel. Don't wield it at all, and you'd rot away in lace, alone with your memories and an increasingly judgmental cat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing who's up with me in the Midnight Museum of Forgotten Lives. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a gravel path where the mourning carriages line up like Gothic limousines. Black plumes bob atop horse heads like depressed parade floats. Your boots crunch as you pass a monument shaped like an angel mid-swoon, arms thrown back like she's auditioning for an opera in hell. Around you, women in their 40s still, stunning under their veils, move like slow tides of shadow, each with a tiny twist of drama in their expressions. Not crying, but carrying the weight of weeping somewhere in the shoulders. You notice something strange. No one looks quite devastated. In fact, some look alive, excited even. Victorian widowhood was a strange, haunted liberation. When a husband died, the woman he left behind was suddenly outside the rules. She couldn't flirt openly, of course, but she could wear gloves. She could let her fingertips brush a man's wrist under the guise of grief. She could lean in close while whispering condolences and let her breath linger longer than modesty allowed. And most scandalous of all, she could be alone, with men, without a chaperone. The funeral was the loophole. A mourning period was also, in its weird way, a dating period. And you've just joined the cast. You walk into the drawing room. It's heavy with heat and tension, both emotional and corset-induced. A large portrait of the deceased looking mildly disappointed in death, as in life, hangs above the fireplace. Women sip tea with their gloves still on, a fashion choice. That screams etiquette, but whispers eroticism. Gloves mattered, they were codes. White gloves, thin and spotless, hinted at virtue. Black gloves, tight and matte, suggested mystery. If you dropped one accidentally, well, that was Victorian for text me later. A man in a waistcoat that smells faintly of tobacco and regret steps beside you. He comments on the lily. You smile barely. That's the move. Too much and you look eager. Too little and you might as well be buried too. Every inch of you is in character. You're grieving, yes, but you're also auditioning for Act 2 of your life. A better husband? Maybe. A secret lover? Possibly. Or just someone who looks at you like you're still alive in a world that wants you to drape yourself in widowhood like a coffin with legs. Historians still argue whether Victorian funerals were truly hotbeds of romantic opportunity, or if we've overinterpreted a few juicy diary entries and tabloid engravings. But the letters exist, the fashion guides exist, and the etiquette manuals. Oh, the manuals. One even included a whole chapter on appropriate interactions with gentlemen at memorial occasions. You weren't supposed to touch of course, but if you did, let it be brief, trembling. And in a corner away from the ants, you spot a woman freshly widowed, judging by the stiff new creases in her veil leaning dangerously close to a military officer. Their conversation is quiet, but their body language screams silent scandal. She touches the edge of his cufflink. He doesn't flinch. If anything, he leans in. Somewhere, a teacup clinks too loudly, and another widow raises an eyebrow. The drama writes itself, and here's where things take a turn. That sensuality, that chessboard of eye contact and etiquette, it wasn't all accidental. Books like The Erotic Spirit Through History argue that grief heightened desire, that loss sharpened the senses, and that for widows, many of whom had never had a say in their own marriage, death was the only real divorce court. With the husband gone, she became her own guardian, her own agent, her own flame. Some did remarry. Many didn't, and some flirted like it was a sport, a reclaiming, a rebellion dressed in crepe and taffeta. Because in a world where you weren't allowed to say, I want, a funeral gave you permission to feel without naming it. You're seated now, balancing a dainty porcelain cup of weak black tea and pretending to be emotionally devastated, while slyly scanning the room like a cat. At a bird convention, the parlor is dimly lit, part tradition, part ambience, and every flickering candle casts 10 shadows. The air is warm from too many bodies and not enough ventilation. And somewhere near the buffet, someone's perfume has turned cloying. Soft piano hums from the corner, played by a cousin no one really likes, but is tolerated because she wears her grief correctly. Around you, the hush of conversation ebbs and flows like waves against an emotional levee. And this is where things get interesting, because Victorian funerals weren't just ceremonies. They were events. Death, in all its black-gloved elegance, became a social calendar fixture. For the well-off, the funeral reception was less about the dearly departed and more about morning theater, complete with refreshments, parlor games. Yes, really, and eligible guests pretending to be emotionally fragile, but very much available. You sip your tea, eye a tray of watercress sandwiches, and casually watch 2 widows, both under 30, engaged in what looks suspiciously like a Cold War of seductive posturing. One adjusts her neckline by a fraction, the other laughs just a bit too brightly at a joke that wasn't funny. Meanwhile, the undertaker, tall, gaunt, and handsomely gloomy, is having an animated conversation with the hostess about floral arrangements. You're not sure if he's discussing Lily or making a move. Possibly both. Victorian etiquette said that funerals were not the place for romance, but Victorian society thrived on contradictions. Mourning required you to withdraw from the world, but also to appear in public just enough to prove your grief. It demanded modesty, but lavished attention on the tiniest expressions of feeling. In other words, you were expected to suffer attractively. And if that suffering happened to take place while sipping sherry next to a handsome colonel with a tragic backstory, well, who could blame you? Especially since no one expected widows to remarry quickly. But everyone whispered about the ones who did. The food table becomes a stage of its own. A widow in second mourning, still in black, but with delicate gray accents, now daintily lifts a forkful of trifle while chatting with a family friend whose mustache could be used as a conversation. Peace. Their laughter is low and intimate. It might be about pudding. It might be about something more. Nearby, 2 elderly aunts exchange judgmental glances, but you can tell they're living for the drama. In private, of course. Quirky detail for the evening. Some households hired professional mourners paid women who would weep convincingly, adding both volume and gravitas to the event. One such mourner, according to a diary from 1875, cried so intensely at a wake that she was offered a job as a governess by the deceased's brother, who admired her passionate soul. She took the job. They married. That, my friend, is what we now call networking. Historians still argue whether these social dynamics were actively encouraged or merely tolerated under the lace of respectability. But letters and memoirs suggest that many attendees, especially those not directly related to the deceased, viewed funerals as acceptable places to reconnect, mingle, and even spark new relationships. Especially in cities where social events were limited by class, gender, and geography, a funeral was often the only place you could get near someone without a chaperone and still maintain plausible innocence. Even the layout of Victorian drawing rooms aided this. Seating was arranged for soft conversation. Curtains muted the light just enough to hide expressions, while mirrors caught every lingering glance. And if you happened to linger near the doorway, just as a gentleman stepped outside for air, well, fate works in mysterious ways. Sex Story Time Tonight's tale comes from Sex with Kings, a book that, while focused on royal lovers, includes a spicy anecdote from 19th century Prussia. A widowed countess, dressed in deep mourning, became the obsession of a visiting duke. Forbidden to speak to her alone, he began sending her black roses and notes hidden inside funeral hymnals. She replied by pressing dried petals into the pages and returning them at church services. Their affair, scandalous but concealed beneath layers of mourning decorum, lasted 2 years, right up until the Duke married a princess. The Countess, legend says, laughed all the way to his funeral. You think about that as you nod politely at a guest who looks like he hasn't smiled since the Crimean War. You're not here to start anything scandalous, but if something scandalous started you, who's really at fault? The room has changed. Since you arrived, laughter bubbles more easily. A widow tells a story that makes someone spit tea in a most undignified fashion. A bachelor tips his hat to someone across the room, and the gesture lingers like a promise. Outside, a crow caws. Inside, someone opens a window and lets in a breeze that smells of roses and secrets. You lean back, set your cup down, and prepare for the next act. You're still seated. The tea has gone tepid, and the mood has shifted from somber to something that feels more like a polite masquerade. You start to notice the small movements, the secret choreography. It's subtle at first. A flick of the wrist, a delicate fan unfurling like the wings of a tired bird. A lady on the fainting couch gently touches her collarbone, not from distress, but because she knows precisely who's watching. The language of Victorian flirtation was a silent opera, and you, lucky thing, have just been handed a front row seat. That woman in the dove-gray veil just dropped her glove. No one around her seems to move, but a gentleman steps forward after a beat too long, retrieves it with a low bow, and places it carefully in her hand. Her fingers curl around it like it's a telegram of passion. You wonder if they've ever spoken before. You wonder if they need to. See, Victorian society may have banned open desire, but it built a sprawling museum of signs, gestures, and props that said everything without a single syllable. You grip your own fan a little tighter now, conscious suddenly of its power. If you open it slowly and look over the top edge, you're saying, "Follow me." If you press it to your lips, it means, "Let's talk later." Dropped suddenly? You might as well be proposing. It's absurd. It's brilliant. It's erotic. You glance around and realize everyone's doing it. Gloves are removed finger by finger like invitations. Handkerchiefs are dabbed at dry eyes in an exaggerated ballet. A lady swipes a single tear that may or may not be real, and a man across the room presses his lips together like he's read a diary she hasn't written yet. And this beautiful absurdity is all happening under the guise of mourning. You spot an elderly woman fanning herself with slow, rhythmic strokes, and you realize she's not cooling off, she's judging. Because here's the thing, the rules existed, but everyone knew them, which meant everyone also knew how to break them strategically. That's the game. That's the flirtation. Even the youngest girls knew to sit with a slight lean, to blink slowly in candlelight, to let their grief shimmer just enough to look poetic. Historians still argue whether these cues were universally understood or simply performed in the hope that anyone would decode them correctly. But diaries and etiquette books make it clear. This was a culture where silence screamed. Let's take a fringe detail for your growing collection of weirdness. Did you know some women had mourning gloves scented with violet or rose oil? Not for themselves, mind you. For the men who might take their hand during a condolence exchange. Imagine gripping that gloved hand and smelling grief wrapped in perfume. That's not just etiquette, that's mood setting. And it wasn't always subtle. There's a documented case of a widow in Kent who embroidered messages into her handkerchiefs in Morse code. One handkerchief was found years later with a phrase that translated to "let me breathe again." Romantic? Maybe. Creepy? A little. Effective? She remarried within 9 months. But let's move to our obligatory sex story, this one from Foucault's History of Sexuality, though you'll have to tilt your imagination slightly sideways. In one peculiar salon in Paris, funerals were followed by small private salons where mourners discussed mortality, poetry, and occasionally shared sensual comforts. One particularly bold widow, famous for her scarlet-lined mourning coat, was rumored to offer whispered readings of erotic poetry to her guests, purely to comfort them, of course. One count confessed in a letter that he attended 5 funerals in 8 weeks hoping to be consoled by her. Whether that's grief, lust, or both tangled in a black veil is a question that doesn't need an answer. You shift your posture now, subtly aware of your own body as language. You brush imaginary lint off your skirt, slowly. Someone watches. You adjust your veil, letting it fall just slightly off-center. Another glance. The room feels like a stage, and you're both the actress and the script. Even the men have tells. They pull at their cuffs, adjust their cravats, tip their hats a little lower. One widower polishes his spectacles every time a particular woman passes. The 3rd time, you're sure it's deliberate. The 4th time, she's sure too. Somewhere, a widow's fan flutters like a heartbeat. Somewhere else, a gentleman's eyes linger a fraction longer than decency suggests. The whole room is practically whispering in semaphore. And yet not a word is spoken. It's a game of looks and lace, of posture and props. It's strangely exciting, it's deeply weird, and it's absolutely delightfully human. You sit back and wonder how many of these coded conversations will be forgotten the moment the guests leave, and how many will turn into letters, or gloved handshakes in church pews, or accidental visits on foggy mornings. The music changes, and you ready yourself to move. The next act is waiting, and so are you. You're outside now, just beyond the parlor windows where the lace curtains whisper in the breeze like gossiping ghosts. The garden is quiet on the surface, but look closer, and you'll see what no etiquette manual dares to print. 2 figures are partially hidden behind a hedge, speaking in low tones, not quite touching. Her gloved hand rests on the wrought iron bench, his boot brushes too near, too often. The veil that once shielded her grief now catches moonlight like spider silk. And in this twilight hush, the very air seems to lean in and listen. This, you realize, is where the real drama begins, not where the body is mourned, but where the living decide how to move forward ... or sideways. The phrase "mourning period" was meant to evoke dignity and restraint. But for many Victorian widows, it became a prolonged, exquisite test of how far desire could stretch without snapping propriety in two. You've entered a space where grief doesn't cancel attraction, it intensifies it. You remember that woman from the drawing room, the one whose morning gown clung like a secret? She's now talking with a man whose black gloves haven't moved from his coat pocket all evening. Scandalous. Gloves on were a sign of respect. Bare hands were something else. His fingers brush hers in the dark. You can almost hear the ants fainting in the distance. This tension, this dangerous possibility of contact, is not accidental. Widow's fashion played into it. Mourning clothes weren't just sad, they were stunning. Heavy, rich, dramatic. Black silk that shimmered like oil. Jet beadwork that moved with every breath. High necklines that made you imagine what lay beneath. Mourning chic became its own sensual language, and some tailors made fortunes cutting gowns designed not to console, but to captivate. You walk the path slowly now, letting your skirt swish just loud enough to be noticed, but not enough to seem intentional. Your bodice is stiff, your spine is straighter than your moral compass, and still you can feel eyes on you. That kind of attention, the kind that sees you not as a relic of a dead man's estate, but as something luminous in the gloom. That's addictive. Historians still argue whether this mourning seduction was truly a social norm or just a rebellious undercurrent. But women's magazines of the time published endless guides on appropriate mourning attire, which reads now like lingerie catalogs for the subtly unrepentant. There's even a reported case from 1881 where a widow was expelled from her church because her mourning gown featured lace trim that was too suggestive of celebration. Celebration. Imagine that. Lace as a felony. Here's your fringe fact. Certain widows used mourning brooches, those little lockets made with a dead husband's hair, not just as mementos, but as signals. Hair worn over the heart. Still grieving. Hair worn at the waist or sleeve. Possibly open to conversation. Yes, it's a bit morbid, but also genius. A wearable status update with built-in plausible deniability. Meanwhile, back in the garden, the quiet couple parts barely an inch between them. He offers his hand to help her step over a puddle. She takes it. Their palms touch for 2 seconds too long. She laughs, softly, as if it's the first real sound she's made in weeks. And just like that, the game is on. Let's dip into tonight's sex story, a quiet thunderclap from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, where one royal mistress, forced into mourning after the death of her husband, turned the court into her personal runway of flirtatious restraint. She wore veils so sheer they bordered on the scandalous gloves that reached her elbows in snowy white, and carried a fan engraved with verses about sorrow. Every man who spoke to her left feeling both comforted and slightly unworthy. The king himself declared her the loveliest tragedy I've ever seen. By the end of the mourning year, she was remarried to the very minister who'd officiated her late husband's funeral. That's not grief. That's an art form. You pause beneath an arbor now, listening to the rustle of ivy and the shifting gravel under polished shoes. The funeral may be over, but no one's leaving. Not yet. The drawing room lights are still on. More tea is being poured. A maid laughs too loudly behind a half-closed door. Somewhere upstairs, an ant is pretending to rest while eavesdropping through a floorboard crack. Victorian households ran on secrets, and death only made the air thicker with them. You return to the garden gate, hands folded, eyes lowered just enough to make it mysterious. A man nods at you from across the hedge. You do not smile. That would be too forward. Instead, you adjust your sleeve, just so. He catches the motion. He stays where he is. Good, let him wait. You're walking now slowly, deliberately, down the narrow gravel path that curves around the churchyard, where stone angels cry eternally over names long worn away. The ground is soft beneath your boots. The air carries a perfume of old roses and damp stone. And just ahead, just barely within earshot, you hear it. Whispers, not prayers, not lamentations. Gossip, pure, unfiltered, razor-edged gossip traded in hushed tones between gloved hands and heavily veiled smiles. The dead are barely in the ground, and already the living are rearranging the storylines. Who fainted too dramatically? Who left too early? Who stayed too late? Who comforted whom a little too closely? It's a genre all its own, graveyard gossip, where mourning is both mask and megaphone. You round the corner, and there they are, three widows, seated like crows on a bench, heads dipped together, voices just low enough to sound reverent. But watch their eyes. They flick toward the chapel, then toward the road where a carriage is pulling away, and then, finally, to the young woman in lavender gray who hasn't waited a full year to shed her black. Scandalous or admirable, depending on your audience. One widow mutters something about unseemly haste. Another raises an eyebrow and murmurs, "She never seemed that grieved." You don't say a word. You're too busy pretending not to listen. Because let's be honest, gossip is the oxygen of funerals. It's how grief stays manageable by turning it into narrative. You take a seat on a low stone wall, pretending to adjust your hem and soak in the atmosphere. Victorian society prized restraint, but its undercurrent was endlessly obsessed with who crossed the line, when, and with whom. Mourning gave women a kind of moral power, but also placed them under microscopic surveillance. You wore black, but not too luxuriously. You wept, but never too dramatically. And heaven help the widow who showed signs of joy too soon, unless of course she did. Eat in private. Historians still argue whether these whispered judgments were about protecting social norms or reinforcing a kind of competitive grief economy. But it's clear that a widow's worth was measured not just in tears, but in timing. And when someone broke the rules, the consequences were complex. Enter tonight's fringe tidbit. In several English towns, local papers ran anonymous mourning columns, not obituaries, but anonymous notes about mourning conduct. One entry from 1872 reads, "Mrs. W. attended the theater while her husband's grave was still fresh. Is love so quickly buried?" Another counters, "Better to laugh at life than lie with the dead." It was the Victorian version of a Twitter feud, slow, poetic, devastating. The real scandal, though, came in the form of ghosting. Not the digital kind, of course, but spiritual. You see, some widows, caught between sorrow and social pressure, claimed they were still visited by their husband's spirits. Sometimes these were gentle, symbolic dreams. Sometimes they were full-blown hauntings, romantic, eerie, and useful. One woman's diary from 1868 describes being kept from temptation by her late husband's ghost, who stood near the hearth whenever I considered removing my mourning dress. Convenient, or maybe brilliant. These ghost stories allowed widows to delay remarriage, to flirt without commitment, to explain loneliness or longing without breaking the social code. And some turned it into performance art. There's even record of a woman in Bath who claimed her husband's ghost would intervene. Whenever suitors got too close, he'd knock over vases, extinguish candles, or whisper through the curtains. She never remarried. She also hosted a salon twice a week where curious men came to hear the ghost. You do the math. But let's not forget tonight's required dose of historical heat. From the erotic spirit through history comes the story of a widow in Florence, who, during her mourning period, took to writing erotic poetry not under her name, but under the initials of her dead husband. Each poem was signed "A Memory Returned." The poems gained popularity, passed hand to hand through salons and garden parties. Eventually, they were traced back to her, and instead of disgrace, she was elevated. Why? Because she had turned desire into grief. Her mourning wasn't shameful. It was art. You wonder how many other women did the same, in smaller, subtler ways. How many glances across graves? How many letters never sent? How many moments of private ecstasy followed by public repentance? You rise now, brushing a fleck of stone dust from your skirt. The sun is low, staining the tombstones gold. The gossip has shifted targets. Now it's the young widow who lingers too long at the colonel's side. She claims he reminds her of her husband. She claims he's helping her navigate her grief. She claims ... Well, it doesn't matter. Claims are irrelevant. Appearances are everything. You pass them as you walk. The colonel gives a brief nod. She looks at you with calm defiance. Her hand rests lightly on his arm, and though no one speaks it aloud, the entire graveyard seems to buzz with one shared thought. She's not going to wait a year. Good for her. You're back indoors now, stepping lightly over the threshold of a boutique that smells of lavender sachets, candle wax, and the faint bitterness of dried violets. The shop is long and narrow, walls lined with jet black silks, mourning hats with dramatic veils, and gloves so soft you'd swear they were stitched from the size of abandoned lovers. This is the mourning market, this strange, seductive retail. Wonderland where grief is not just processed but curated. The woman behind the counter, dressed in a matte black gown with a collar high enough to be legally binding, greets you with the kind of solemn smile that says, "My condolences," and, "Would you like matching cufflinks with that grief bonnet?" Because in the Victorian era, mourning wasn't just an emotion, it was an economy, and business was booming. You trail your fingers along a display of brooches made from human hair tight, perfect spirals arranged like funereal calligraphy. Beneath glass, some are heartbreakingly tender, inscribed with initials and dates. Others, though, are oddly flirty, a lock of hair bound in gold, paired with a miniature portrait and a tiny love poem etched so faintly you need candlelight too. Read it. Death, it seems, has a marketing department. You move past shelves stacked with mourning, stationary black-bordered cards with embossed angels and sad cherubs clutching lily, and pause at a display of weeping colognes, floral blends mixed with just enough musk to remind the wearer of long nights and longer regrets. Behind a velvet curtain, you catch a glimpse of mourning corsets. Yes, corsets specifically designed for funerals, tighter than virtue, and twice as uncomfortable. They come in jet, matte obsidian, and something called eternal dusk, which is really just an excuse to sell navy silk at a premium. The widowhood industry is full of little lies like that. And it works because you need these things. Don't you? Or at least you're told you do. Because if your grief isn't visible, commodified, draped across your body in 3 distinct stages deep, secondary, and half mourning, did it really happen? That's the question no one asks aloud, but every shopgirl and seamstress quietly reinforces with a well-timed frown. Historians still argue whether this commercialization of mourning was born out of genuine ritual or sheer capitalist brilliance, but either way, it became a machine. Entire neighborhoods catered to the bereaved. Some women spent more on mourning garments than their wedding gowns. Mourning hats had fashion cycles. Mourning jewelry had catalogs. Some widows were known to change outfits 3 times a day, not because they wanted to, but because others would notice if they didn't. But not all of it was performative. Some women found power here, control. When everything else had collapsed, the marriage, the household, the carefully curated identity mourning clothes offered a uniform, a shield, a script, and for the clever ones, a means to seduce under the radar. Take tonight's fringe example. A particular brand of face powder, made with trace amounts of arsenic, became wildly popular among mourning widows. Why? Because it made the skin unnaturally pale, almost ghostly, a little dangerous, a little haunting. Men found it oddly captivating. One reviewer at the time wrote, "She looked not quite living, and yet I could not look away. Romantic poison in a powder puff. That's the vibe." You try on a mourning bonnet in the mirror. It frames your face like a Victorian Instagram filter, soft, tragic, mysterious. A shop assistant adjusts the veil so it hangs at just the right angle to blur your smile, but not your eyes. "You want them to wonder what you're thinking," she says softly. "Not what you're hiding." You nod. She gets it. They all do. But let's step deeper into tonight's sensual archive. Straight from Kama Sutra via its 19th century European interpreter's one translation, circulated privately in gentlemen's clubs, told of a widow in Bombay who conducted private mourning consultations with suitors, ostensibly spiritual sessions. These meetings began with prayer and ended with shared warmth beneath layers of ceremonial cloth. It's unclear if she saw herself as a courtesan, a healer, or something in between. Her clientele included both British officers and local poets, and each believed she mourned just for them. You admire the game. You respect the clarity. You purchase a small black fan, the kind that folds with a snap like punctuation. As you step out into the street, the late afternoon light hits you just right. You look like a figure from a painting, graceful, unreadable, vaguely tragic. Men glance, then look away. Women glance, then look longer. You carry a package tied with a ribbon, the color of bruised fruit, and as you walk back toward the funeral gathering, you feel different, sharper, a little dangerous. Because now you understand, mourning isn't just about sorrow. It's about performance, about power. And in a world that treats widows like relics or threats, you're allowed to be both. You're standing in front of a door, now oak, carved, slightly warped by time. Behind it lies the kind of room that changes everything. You hesitate for a moment, then knock. Once, twice. A pause. It opens. And just like that, you step into the drawing room of a widow who has turned her husband's death into her origin story. The parlor is flooded with soft afternoon light that's been filtered through layers of gauzy drapes, casting a golden haze over the furniture. There are no men here, only women. And yet the room buzzes with the kind of tension usually reserved for a duel or a love confession. Because here, the widow isn't a victim. She's the hostess, the center, the conductor of a symphony no one else can quite hear. Her gown is exquisite, a deep black with violet undertones that catch the light like bruised silk. No white lace, no gray compromise. Full mourning, but cut to the body like sin wrapped in sorrow. She raises a hand, beckons you to sit, and you realize this is not a support circle. This is a strategy meeting. Because for the right woman, widowhood was not a pause, it was a power-up. Her husband, dead these 11 months, left behind a modest estate, a manageable debt, and a reputation she no longer has to protect. And with him gone, she can sign contracts. She can rent out rooms. She can attend events without a man's escort or permission. She is, for the first time in her life, a legal adult in the eyes of the law. It's a dark magic, this widow's freedom, and it's not given, it's seized. Historians still argue whether this independence was truly empowering or merely another cage, just one with velvet bars and gold-trimmed curtains. But letters and court records suggest something else. Some widows use their status like a weapon, carefully, elegantly, and without apology. The widow before you pours tea with hands that never tremble. Her voice is soft, but every word lands with precision. She mentions investments, tenants, a distant cousin looking for lodging mail, unmarried. Her eyebrow arches a little. She doesn't smile, but the air changes. You sip your tea and feel it. This is no mourning party. This is a woman reclaiming the map of her life, redrawing borders, planting flags. And you, guess that you are both witness and accomplice. She walks you through the house, later past the late husband's study, untouched except for the removal of his whiskey cabinet and hunting trophies. They made the place feel smaller, she says simply. Then down the hall to his sunroom filled with plants, all thriving. You pass a small portrait turned to face the wall. You don't ask. She doesn't explain. But you understand. Some ghosts are better left unacknowledged. Now for your nightly indulgence. Let's talk about the infamous Duchess from Sex with Kings, widowed young, rich in property, and devastating in charm. She refused every suitor, male or female, and instead hosted salons where she read scandalous literature under the pretense of intellectual mourning. One visitor described her as a cathedral in mourning robes, but with the laugh of a barmaid. Another claimed he proposed marriage in a moment of passion, to which she allegedly replied, "Darling, why would I dig another grave for myself?" Icon, legend, possibly real, possibly myth. Completely unforgettable. And here's a fringe detail that feels almost too modern. In parts of Victorian London, certain widows formed discreet societies, essentially grief clubs that functioned as both emotional support groups and matchmaking forums. They met under the guise of shared prayer, but what really happened was a kind of quiet revolution. They helped each other find apartments, legal assistance, and yes, introductions to respectable gentlemen of character. One woman's diary notes that the society helped her vet 3 suitors, one of whom she later married, with cautious optimism and a deep drawer of secrets. That's the beauty of widowhood. You've seen the curtain pulled back. You know how short the play can be, and you don't clap for actors who phone it in anymore. You prefer honesty, or at least well-crafted illusion. The widow in front of you pauses at a window, watching 2 neighbors argue over garden hedges. Her lip twitches. "He cried louder at my husband's funeral than I did," she says. You can't tell if she's proud, bitter, or amused. Maybe all 3. That's the trick of it. Grief isn't one color. It's a spectrum. And widows live at the edges where the palette gets muddy and unpredictable. You leave the house feeling like you've walked through a mirror. The world outside is still bright, still bustling. But you move differently now, a little straighter, a little slower. Because you know, behind closed doors and under heavy veils, women like her, and maybe now women like you, are rewriting the rules. Not with noise, with silence sharp enough to cut glass. You sit near the back pew, hands folded neatly in your lap, the air thick with incense and restraint. The chapel is dim, lit only by the flicker of beeswax candles that seem to lean toward sin. You're not here for salvation, though everyone pretends they are. You're here because the preacher is young, eloquent, and has the kind of voice that makes scripture sound like seduction. And he keeps glancing at you, just barely, just long enough to be noticed. The organ moans in the background, solemn and holy, but you feel a pulse under it, something warm, human, very much alive. You're not the only one. Around you, the pews are filled with widows in various stages of mourning, their veils sheer, their corsets cruel, their expressions unreadable. It's less a congregation than a silent competition. Who looks the most devastated? Who wore just enough gray to signal emotional progress without appearing heartless? Who's going to accidentally brush against the reverend's sleeve after the sermon? You know the game. Everyone here does. Because for many Victorian women, Sunday service was the only acceptable outing during deep mourning, the only chance to be seen, to move, to exist outside of 4 walls and a funeral frame. And the church, in its infinite irony, became a theater of restrained longing. The pulpit just another stage, the pews, rows of possibilities. The preacher clears his throat, begins his sermon on the mysteries of divine comfort, and you try not to smirk. It's good. He quotes the Psalms. He glances your way again. He mentions loss, the kind that leaves people aching for a human touch, even while grasping toward God. A woman 2 rows up dabs her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. You suspect her tears are genuine. You suspect her plan is not. This isn't sacrilege, it's survival. You straighten your spine, a move that shifts the drape of your dress just so. Victorian mourning attire, heavy as it is, still obeys gravity, and gravity always reveals. Somewhere beside you, a cane taps the floor with too much rhythm to be accidental. It's an older man, impeccably dressed, leaning ever so slightly toward the aisle for a better view. You pretend not to notice. He pretends he's not watching. God pretends he isn't taking notes. Historians still argue whether these subtle flirtations within sacred spaces were condemned or merely ignored by the church, but correspondence from certain bishops suggests a quiet awareness. One particularly scandalized letter from 1876 described an increase in female attendance to early services, dressed in mourning but painted in desire. Painted in desire. That's not theology. That's poetry with judgment issues. You stand. As the hymn begins, your voice soft, blending with the women around you who are not quite singing. Just enough sound to appear devout, not enough to seem joyful. A balance as always. But the most dangerous moment comes after the mingling in the churchyard. That brief span of time where greetings are exchanged, gloved hands are clasped, and eyes meet without the armor of prayer. The preacher is at the gate. You walk toward him, slowly, intentionally. You're greeted with a nod, a smile, a pause before he moves to the next. He says your name, and in that moment, something changes. You've been seen, not just as a figure of grief, but as a woman in full. And that's more intoxicating than any sermon. Now for your evening indulgence, tonight's tale comes from Sex with Kings, the story of a French cardinal who during a period of forced celibacy developed special spiritual arrangements with 3 widows. They visited him weekly. Confession, prayer, and then silent companionship in the rectory garden. It was all very respectful, except for the part where one of the widows was later found with a locked diary containing poems, addressed to my red-robed temptation. Subtle? No. Effective? Definitely. And here's a fringe tidbit. Certain Victorian corsets, particularly mourning corsets, were designed with hidden pockets, not for vanity items, but for letters, love notes, tokens. One particularly infamous case involved a widow who kept a lock of her new lover's hair in a tiny pouch near her ribs, right beside a miniature of her late husband. It wasn't confusion. It was commentary. She was her own altar now. You walked the edge of the churchyard slowly, the stones underfoot. Uneven, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and faded violets. A few others linger, pretending to discuss scripture, but really eyeing each other with quiet intensity. You catch snatches of conversation, offers of tea, condolences repeated with meaning, plans for visits to discuss estate matters. Every word is layered, every silence is loaded. You pass the preacher one last time. His fingers brush yours as he hands you a folded leaflet. You nod, walk away. Later, when no one is looking, you unfold it. Inside isn't scripture. It's a single line in careful handwriting. I believe in second chances. No signature. No instructions. Just permission. You fold it again, slide it into your glove, and keep walking. Because you've got the rest of the morning year to decide what kind of salvation you actually want. You open your eyes to candlelight and the scent of sandalwood, your fingertips resting on a velvet cloth as cool as moonlight. Across from you, a woman dressed entirely in black holds your gaze with calm, practiced focus. Between you, the planchette twitches. You didn't push it. At least not consciously. Welcome to the seance parlor, where grief becomes ritual, longing becomes electricity, and flirtation dances with the dead. This is where the rules unravel, where Victorian restraint is peeled back, layer by layer, under the cover of spiritual inquiry. You're not here for answers, you're here for connection. And connection, in this room, often begins at the fingertips. There's a man to your right. You've never spoken beyond introductions, but now your pinky is brushing his, and neither of you moves away. The medium murmurs a name, no one you know, but the air tightens anyway. Your breath catches, and that electric would-have curls up your spine. Because in this dim room, veiled in incense and plausible deniability, no one's watching, and everyone's feeling. Seances were meant to contact the other side, but they often connected the very much alive instead. you glance around. The participants are a blend of the bereft and the curious, draped in shadows and excitement. Some have lost husbands. Some claim to have lost lovers. Others lost nothing but their patience with polite society. And now they gather here where spirits knock on tables and letters arrive through hands that tremble a little too much to be purely spiritual. Historians still argue whether Victorian spiritualism was a true religious movement or just psychological theater for the lonely and repressed. But personal journals, especially from women, reveal an undeniable truth. These gatherings gave space for intimacy, physical, emotional, and sometimes deeply sensual, that couldn't be accessed anywhere else. The boundary between holy and horny, between loss and lust, blurred like breath on glass. You close your eyes as the planchette moves again. A name is spelled. The medium gasps. The man beside you grips your hand by accident, of course. But he doesn't let go. Neither do you. The table knocks once, then again. And somewhere between the second and third knock, the room shifts. It always does. Eyes glaze, breaths deepen, shoulders brush. It's part ritual, part seduction done in complete silence. But don't let the theatrics fool you. This was the place where many Victorian widows reclaimed something long denied to them, the right to feel. And feeling, as you're learning, doesn't always obey the expected script. Tonight's fringe tidbit? Some seance circles had coded candle arrangements. 3 candles for grief, 4 for forgiveness, 5 for openness. A certain hostess in Brighton was known to use 6. The 6th candle, as rumor had it, meant physical comfort permitted. She never confirmed this. She never denied it either. Her salons were always full. But now, your favorite moment, Anne. Authentic historical encounter tucked just beneath the corset of propriety. In the erotic spirit through history, there's an account of a widow in Vienna whose spiritual practice was so sought after that men traveled across Europe to hear her speak in trance. During one such session, a diplomat swore he felt his late wife's presence in the room. The widow, allegedly possessed, whispered secrets only the wife could know. Later, it was revealed they had never met. But they did repeatedly after that seance. His letters describe her voice as a warmth I forgot I deserved. Whether you believe in spirits or not, the effect was real. These rituals weren't just entertainment. They were bridges between lives, between people, between possibilities. You lean slightly into the table now, the man beside you mirroring your motion. Your hands rest beside each other, not quite touching, but near enough to feel every shift. The medium hums softly. Someone gasps. Someone sobs. But you? You're steady, because this isn't grief. This is choice. A new language, spoken through silence, scented candles, and the careful pressure of a pinky brushing yours again, this time deliberately. You step outside after the seance, breath catching in the crisp night air. The stars are out. Your cheeks are flushed. The man offers you a handkerchief for your hands, not your eyes. He smiles. It's the first real smile you've seen all day. You thank him. You don't give your name, yet, but you do look back as you walk away, letting your veil slip just enough to let the candlelight catch your eyes. And he watches. Of course he does. Because grief brought you here, but now you're dancing just beyond its reach. You wake up the next morning to birdsong and the slow golden crawl of sunlight across a morning dress still draped over your chair. It's been a year, maybe more. The black fabric has faded to something softer now, the stiffness worn out of. The seams like the edge worn off your grief. You sit at the vanity, fingers tracing the faint creases around your eyes that didn't used to be there. You're not mourning anymore. Not in the way they expect, at least. But you're also not who you were before the funeral. And now, you face the most dangerous question of all. What comes next? Victorian society had an answer for that, of course it did. After the proper period of mourning, deep mourning, secondary mourning, and then half mourning, like grief had. A staircase and a dress code for every step. A widow could return to society, which meant, in polite language, she could remarry, should remarry, was expected to remarry assuming she hadn't already flirted herself into exile. But what if she didn't? What if she liked the quiet, the freedom, the subtle thrill of being watched without being owned? You stand and stretch, your corset left hanging on the bedpost like a relic of another life. You won't wear it today. Not because you're scandalous, but because your lungs finally asked for a day off. You dress in slate gray silk something. Simple, clean, tailored just enough to hint that you remember how it feels to be admired. And then you walk into town. Past the milliner's shop with its fresh veils on display. Past the church where the curate once handed you a folded sermon, with a note inside. Past the house where a neighbor still whispers that you moved on too quickly. You ignore her. You've had practice. You pass by a young widow new to the role, fresh black gown, stiff spine, eyes searching every face for something familiar. You catch her gaze, just for a second. And in that second, you pass her something more important than sympathy. You pass her permission. She need it. Because no one warns you that the hardest part of mourning is not the beginning, it's the after. When the casseroles stop. When the whispers change tone. When people expect you to pick a new narrative and stick to it. Are you the tragic widow? The devout one? The fallen woman? The coy flirt? You've been all of them for a while. You're tired of all of them now. Historians still argue whether widows truly regained autonomy in this era, or were simply reabsorbed into new roles with prettier labels. But you know what you've lived. And you know the difference between freedom and flexibility. You arrive at the bookshop. The owner nods, he knows your preferences by now. You buy a volume of poetry, a scandalous novel in plain binding, and a tin of violet pastilles. No one questions it. You walk to the park where the benches are full of chattering girls and stiff-spined mothers. You sit, you read, you remove one glove. You let the sun touch your wrist. And then he arrives. Not him, not the one. Just someone. A man who smiled at you once at a funeral and then never looked away quite the same again. He sits beside you. He asks what you're reading. You tell him. He laughs, low, surprised, genuinely amused. There's a pause. Then he asks if you'd like to walk. And you think, why not? Why not walk beside someone, just once, without it being a statement or an escape or a replacement for something lost? Just two people walking forward, uncertain but interested. You say yes, not because you're ready to fall in love or marry or reinvent yourself, but because you're no longer afraid of being seen in the daylight. That's the real end of mourning, not when the tears stop, but when the shadows lose their power. And now, for your final flicker of history, there's a widow mentioned in Sex with Kings, never named, only described, who never remarried, never scandalized, never re-entered society at all. And yet, men visited her regularly. They left. Her house with books, with flowers, with rumors. No one ever proved anything. But she lived well into her 80s, had her portrait painted in silver lace, and reportedly died with a smile. Her last diary entry read, "They never understood. Me, that was the gift." And now, as you walk along the river path with your maybe suitor, listening to the birds and letting the breeze tease your hemline, you understand that entry more than you ever could before. You don't need to be understood. You just need space. To become. The breeze is soft now, slower than before, carrying nothing but the faint rustle of leaves and the quiet sigh of something ending. You close the book, trace your thumb along the worn edges, and feel the world exhale with you. The gowns are folded away. The candles burned low. And the woman you were when this began has changed her shape. No louder than a whisper, but deep. as thunder in the chest. Let the night hold you now, lightly, kindly. Let your breath settle like dust on a closed piano. You've walked through the velvet corridors of grief and come out the other side taller, quieter, stronger. And whether you loved again or never needed to, doesn't matter. What matters is this: you lived. End of script. Sweet dreams,